The health inspector arrived at my door with 2 police officers, a fire marshal, and a clipboard so thick it looked like it could double as a blunt force weapon. I was in my backyard, tending to ribs on my smoker, when they showed up right in the middle of service, with 5 paying customers waiting on brisket and a peach cobbler still heating in the outdoor oven. The inspector announced, in the stiffest official voice he could manage, that he'd received a complaint accusing me of running a commercial operation in a residential neighborhood. The complaint came from none other than Margaret Susan Blackwell, our HOA president and self-appointed ruler of the block, who considered the smoke from my grill a form of aesthetic contamination and declared my barbecue sauce, in her words, too bold for the refined palates of Silverstone Gardens. She had absolutely no idea who she was picking a fight with. I'm David Garrett, a former Marine turned remote software developer with a devotion to smoking meat that borders on spiritual. When I moved to Silverstone Gardens 3 years ago, I thought I'd found the perfect quiet suburb where I could settle in. The HOA seemed like a mild nuisance at most, something I could brush aside while enjoying my big backyard and the luxury of working from home. After my company went fully remote, I had more free time, and what began as weekend cookouts for friends gradually developed into something bigger. I called it Garrett's Smokehouse, though it wasn't a real business in any official capacity. Just word-of-mouth orders from neighbors and friends who couldn't resist the lure of authentic Texas-style brisket that had been smoking for 14 straight hours. No front yard signage, no marketing, no drive-through line. Just me, custom-built smoker, and meat so tender it surrendered under the fork. On good weekends, I'd feed 20 or 30 people, all swinging by my backyard like it was the most exclusive pop-up in town. That's when Margaret Susan Blackwell inserted herself into the story. She lived 3 houses down and had been HOA president for 7 years, mostly because no one else wanted to put in the effort required to unseat her. Margaret was the kind of person who measured lawn height with a ruler and sent violation warnings if your mailbox wasn't the perfect shade of approved black. She operated the HOA like her own personal empire, and she despised the scent of hickory smoke drifting over her manicured yard during her Saturday yoga routines. It started with passive-aggressive notes tucked into my mailbox. She mentioned concerns about increased foot traffic in the neighborhood. Then came a formal warning about unauthorized gatherings on HOA property even though it was my own backyard. The 3rd letter came with a photograph of one of my perfectly smoked ribs, with the words, "Is this zoning compliant?" scribbled across it in red marker. I should have realized then that she was documenting everything, methodically building a case like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Then came the fines. $100 for commercial signage, which turned out to be the chalkboard menu sitting inside my garage. $200 for creating food-related odors that violated the HOA's ambient standards. $350 for conducting unauthorized commerce on HOA-regulated grounds. I appealed every single fine through the official process, and I actually won the first 2, because even the board thought Margaret was being unreasonable. But then she called an emergency meeting and somehow pushed through new bylaw amendments directly targeting outdoor cooking for profit. That's when she started flying a drone over my backyard during my busiest hours, recording photos and videos of every customer. She filed complaints with the health department, fire department, and even animal control, claiming my barbecue was drawing dangerous wildlife. One of my regulars, a lawyer named Patricia, told me Margaret had been going door to door trying to build support for shutting down what she dramatically called my underground meat syndicate. Most neighbors laughed at her, especially the ones who'd tasted my burnt ends. But Margaret was relentless. Things escalated when she convinced 2 other board members that I was running an illegal restaurant, tanking property values. She presented a 40-page report at the next HOA meeting, complete with charts of smoke dispersion patterns and hypothetical property depreciation projections. I went to that meeting carrying a tray of my signature jalapeno mac and cheese, which I conveniently placed near the podium. Half the board members were sneaking bites while Margaret lectured them about commercial kitchen codes and the sanctity of zoning rules. Then came the day she finally called the authorities. I was midway through pulling a 12-pound brisket off the smoker when a convoy of official vehicles rolled up to my driveway. 2 police officers, the health inspector, and the fire marshal all looked deeply uncomfortable as they gathered outside. One of the younger officers, couldn't have been older than 25, kept glancing at the smoker with clear interest. The health inspector, though, stayed all business. He held a printed complaint from Margaret listing alleged violations ranging from almost plausible to completely ridiculous. According to her, I was guilty of unregulated meat sales, creating a fire hazard with my flammable hickory behavior, and producing unauthorized peach-based desserts that lacked approval from the State Food Safety Board. The fire marshal took one look at my setup and actually burst out laughing. My smoker was positioned exactly where the code required, with the correct clearance from structures and a commercial fire suppressor within easy reach. The health inspector asked for my permits, clearly assuming I'd have none. That's when I brought out my folder. State-issued cottage food operator license check. Smoke compliance waiver from the city check. A backyard zoning exemption I obtained from the City Council 6 months earlier, when I anticipated trouble check. I even had a food handler certification and liability insurance. The inspector flipped through the paperwork with growing disbelief. Everything was legal and meticulously documented. I'd researched every regulation, checked every requirement, and made sure I operated strictly within the law. Finally, the older police officer, the one who'd been silent until then, spoke up. He said, "This feels like a waste of everyone's time," and suggested this was clearly an HOA issue, not a criminal concern. I offered them all some brisket to take with them, which they declined politely, but firmly, though I definitely saw the younger officer glance back at it longingly as they walked away. The health inspector handed me his card and told me to call if things escalated again, adding with a faint grin that my setup was one of the most immaculate he'd inspected. Margaret was standing in her driveway watching the entire scene unfold, and when all those official vehicles rolled off without shutting me down, her face turned a shade of purple. I'd only ever achieved using my blackberry barbecue sauce. Later that night, I found a note taped to my smoker reading, "This ends now. I know where your firewood supplier lives." That's when I realized things had reached a point where I needed to take real action. Threatening my wood supplier meant threatening the backbone of my entire operation, and there was no way I was going to let a power-drunk HOA president bully me or anyone connected to my business. So I hired Patricia, the lawyer, who was also one of my most loyal customers. Together, we filed a lawsuit against both Margaret personally and the entire HOA board. Our claims included harassment, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of my rights as a small business owner. Patricia was practically thrilled. She'd been waiting for someone bold enough to challenge Margaret's tyrannical hold over the neighborhood. We requested full discovery, which forced Margaret and the HOA to produce every document related to their campaign against me. And the discovery phase was nothing short of glorious. Margaret had been obsessively detailed in her record-keeping, which turned out to be her downfall. We located receipts showing she'd used HOA funds to buy her surveillance drone, multiple legal consultation fees, specifically about neighborhood grill containment strategies, and even a pre-made cease and desist letter template she'd titled "Pork Offenders" in her files. There were emails to board members with subject lines like "Operation Charcoal," "How to Smoke Out Garrett Legally," and "Emergency Brisket Situation Escalating." The most damaging piece of evidence was a string of emails between Margaret and her sister, in which she openly admitted she had no legal basis to shut me down. She simply wanted to make my life so unbearable that I'd quit on my own. She wrote, and I quote, "If I have to smell hickory smoke one more Saturday, I'm going to lose my mind." This neighborhood was perfect before that meat-obsessed jarhead moved in. When Patricia read that, she practically danced around the room. It proved obvious bias and malicious intent. We also found that Margaret had been deceiving the other board members about the number of complaints. She had submitted most of them herself, using slightly altered versions of her name, listing each as a separate resident grievance. Out of the alleged 37 complaints filed about my operation, 34 came from Margaret, her husband Roger, and her adult daughter, who didn't even live in Silverstone Gardens. The remaining 3 were simply about the smell, and 2 of those neighbors had since become weekly customers. The court date arrived on a perfect October Thursday morning. Margaret walked in with her lawyer, a jittery man in an oversized suit who kept clearing his throat. Patricia came armed with a presentation she titled, "Smoke and Freedom," dedicated to defending backyard barbecue rights. She systematically walked through every detail, showing how Margaret had abused her position, diverted HOA funds, and waged a personal vendetta disguised as official action. The judge, a stern older woman named Roberta Harrison, grew visibly irritated as the evidence mounted. When Margaret's lawyer tried claiming I was destroying the cultural identity of the neighborhood, Judge Harrison actually laughed. Then Patricia unveiled our knockout punch, a video from Margaret's own Facebook page, posted 2 months before her complaint crusade began, showing her in my backyard, eating ribs and declaring on camera that it was the best barbecue she'd ever tasted. The timestamp placed it at the neighborhood's 4th of July party. Margaret insisted she'd only eaten the food to gather evidence, but the footage clearly displayed her returning for seconds, then thirds, even asking me for extra sauce. Her lawyer sank into his chair when Patricia presented an email Margaret had sent me the next day, thanking me for the incredible meal and asking whether I could cater her book club. Patricia highlighted that this request proved Margaret knew about my cooking and had no issue with it until something changed 2 months later. That something, as we discovered, was that I'd been selected to cater the HOA's annual summer picnic instead of her sister-in-law's catering company, which had held the job for 5 consecutive years. This detail emerged when Margaret took the stand and cracked under Patricia's questioning. She admitted, nearly trembling with fury, that she couldn't stand the idea of my backyard setup receiving recognition she believed belonged to her family. Judge Harrison had heard enough. She ruled in my favor on every claim. Margaret was held personally liable for harassment and defamation and fined $25,000 in damages. The HOA was ordered to cover all my legal fees, another $15,000, and issue a formal public apology in the neighborhood newsletter. I also received a permanent exemption from all HOA restrictions related to my backyard cooking, provided I maintained my proper permits. But the best moment was when Judge Harrison looked Margaret directly in the eye and said that in her 30 years on the bench, she'd rarely witnessed such blatant abuse of authority and personal vendetta masked as official governance. She recommended the HOA consider revising its bylaws and implementing term limits. She also warned that any further harassment could lead to criminal charges. Margaret's face went from purple to pale to a sickly green I'd never seen on anyone before. The aftermath was immediate. An emergency HOA meeting convened that same evening, and by a vote of 47-3, Margaret was stripped of her presidency and banned from ever holding any HOA position again. The only 3 votes in her favor came from her husband, Roger, and 2 board members who hadn't attended court. When the tally was announced, Margaret leapt to her feet, knocked over her chair, and shouted that we'd all regret this when property values crashed and the neighborhood descended into smoke and madness. Then she stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to crack the glass.